This lecture is the first step in our discussion of the rhetorical devices, which are ways that we try to persuade people. There are four major rhetorical devices as outlined by Aristotle, but we're only going to be focusing on three of them for this class. The purpose of this exploration is to make you more critical readers in relation to the texts that we'll be exploring, but also in relation to your own research. Because of that, the focus of this lecture is to first understand what the rhetorical devices are, and then to discuss how we may have used these devices in our own lives. And then we'll look at reasons why these devices do and do not work. Once we've completed the lecture, we'll go ahead and put this theory into practice. Before we look at the examples, however, I'm going to give you an introduction to the terms. So as I mentioned, there are three terms that we'll be focusing on. The first that we'll be looking at is logos, which I think based on the word, you can get an idea that it's probably related to logic, and that's what it is. Logos is an appeal to logic and is a way of persuading an audience by reason. The second rhetorical device is pathos. And pathos is an appeal to emotion, and it's a way of convincing an audience of an argument by creating an emotional appeal. And the third is ethos, and that is an appeal to ethics, and it is a means of convincing someone of the character or credibility of the persuader. I think most of the time when we're thinking about argument, we focus a lot on the logos, the idea of whether or not the argument is logically sound. And that's an important aspect, especially if you end up having to write a counter argument. If you understand the logic to the argument, then it will make it better or easier for you to combat the argument. But what people don't realize is that argument also is tied to how we feel, and it is also tied to the credibility of the person doing the arguing. As you can see by this image, there is the idea that logos, pathos, and ethos should be balanced. Before I discuss this balance, though, I want to talk about what logos, pathos, and ethos might look like. So if you look at the definition or the details that I have here, the main techniques for logos would simply be the structure of the speech or the structure of the argument, references to studies, statistics, and case studies, and then also comparisons, analogies, and metaphors. These are things that are tangible. But if we look at the ethos and the pathos, these are things that are maybe not necessarily as tangible. So pathos, which again is how I am trying to manipulate the emotions of the audience, that can be tied to telling stories, inspirational quotes, vivid language. If I'm using language in particular that will impact the way you view my argument, that's important. And if we go beyond the written text, so if we go to like a movie or a commercial, the use of music absolutely would be a way of trying to manipulate the emotions of the audience. Ethos, again, goes back to the credibility of the person who is doing the argument. And so the techniques for credibility could be personal branding, or just the confidence that you have in the delivery of your argument, or citing credible sources. Another aspect that could contribute to ethos might be where you've been published. If I get published in the Inquirer, that doesn't make me a very credible reporter. But if I get it published in the New York Times, that will make me a much more credible reporter. Ideally, logos, pathos, and ethos should be balanced, as this triangle is presenting right here. However, there are things that can offset that balance. And so even if you have a very logical argument, if the audience is not receptive to the argument or isn't emotionally moved by the argument, then the argument won't work. Similarly, if the audience feels very strongly about the person doing the arguing, and this can be a positive emotion or a negative emotion, it will impact how the audience views the logos, the logic of the argument. And so in order for this triangle to truly work, there has to be a neutral relationship, I think, between the audience and the person doing the arguing. If it's a positive relationship, then it really doesn't matter if the logic works. And if it's a negative relationship, then it really doesn't matter if the logic works. And ultimately, the audience, as I said, has to be receptive to what you're saying. So let's go ahead and put this into practice. I like to use the sample or the example that maybe you're arguing with your parents why you need to go to Mexico for the weekend with your friends. And I don't know if you've gone to Mexico with your friends or had to have this argument. I've never had to have this argument in my life, but I think that this is sort of a typical way of how we might approach an argument. So the logos are logical reasons for why you should have to go or get to go to Mexico. One, it will allow you the opportunity to learn about a new culture. It will give them some alone time. It will allow you the opportunity to practice Spanish. And you are 18 or older, so if you happen to drink down there, which you wouldn't, it would be legal. These are all logical arguments, but many times that doesn't work, especially with parents. So then what's the next step? Pathos. Don't you trust me? Everyone else's parents are letting them go. You never let me do anything fun. You are such great parents, and I love you so much. You have to let me go out and experience the world at some point. And then my favorite one, you can't control my life forever. And then you'll slam the door because, you're storming out. But again, if you look at what's going on with this pathos and how it's different from the logos, this is trying to manipulate the emotions of the audience versus just giving reasons why it would be a good idea to go. And then, of course, ethos. If the logic doesn't work and if the pathos doesn't work, then you start talking about your own credibility. And so, what are the things you might say about your own credibility? My grades have been good for the past 3 years. I'm a very responsible person. I've done all of my chores without complaint for the past 2 weeks. I promise I'll be careful. And then my favorite, remember how I called you when my friends were too drunk to drive? So there's an assumption that you are a responsible person because you called your parents. And then I promise that I'll call you every day. So the ethos is about me, the arguer. The pathos is about you, the listener. I'm going to go ahead and switch over because that's an argument that's maybe a day-to-day casual argument, but I want to show you an essay where the author, Jonathan Swift, he wrote this essay called A Modest Proposal. He wrote it in the 1700s. I'm not going to require that you read it, and I will just give you an overall discussion of what it was about, a summary. But the thing that I like about his essay is that he uses the logos, the pathos, and the ethos really well, but he is not persuasive. And we'll talk about why. So his purpose in writing his proposal is that he noticed that in the country of Ireland, there was an issue with poverty. And so what I have here is just one small section of his proposal. And it's the opening paragraph where he's trying to elicit some pathos about the poor people in Ireland. He says it is a melancholy object to those who walk through this great town or travel in the country, when they see the streets, the roads, and cabin doors crowded with beggars of the female sex, followed by 3, 4, 6 children all in rags, and importuning every passenger for an alms. These mothers, instead of being able to work for their honest livelihood, are forced to employ all their time in strolling to beg sustenance for their helpless infants who, as they grow up, either turn thieves for want of work, or leave their dear native country to fight for the pretender in Spain, or they sell themselves to the Barbados. So he uses this pathos to get his reader's attention for his argument because he's come up with a solution for this issue of poverty in Ireland. And his solution is, to end poverty in Ireland, we must eat the children. I can't imagine why people weren't receptive to that. So let's think about what his logos was. What were his logical reasons for why this would be a good idea? He says it will give the poor revenue because they can sell their children to the butchers. It will introduce new dishes and new recipes. It will provide new materials for gloves and shoes. It will save the senseless slaughter of pigs because we will no longer be eating pork, we will be eating children. It will reduce the number of papists. Papists are Catholics, and again, the Irish, many are Catholics, so do the math there. It will introduce currency into the Irish economy, and it will prevent abortion because instead of aborting their children, they will give birth to them and then sell them so that we can eat them. He has other arguments, and again, if you take out what he's arguing and just look at the logic itself is sound. You could do this. It would do this. Let's think about what he does for pathos. He uses vivid images of the desperate poor as they walk around town. So what I showed you in that previous slide, he's constantly using animal terms to reference humans. So he says a child just dropped from its dam. And it's a technique that is enforcing or causing the audience to disassociate from the fact that we're talking about eating humans. He wants you to think of them in animal type terms. And then he reinforces the idea that this is what the poor want. He actually even mentions that if you had asked someone who was poor if they would rather have been eaten at a year old or lived a life of poverty, that they would have said they'd rather have been eaten. What does he do for his ethos? Well, he's done his research. All throughout the essay, he's constantly going back to his supposed sources. And again, these are fake sources because he actually didn't know any people who were cannibals. But he calculates the numbers. He does this a lot. He has talked to other people from other countries who have also instituted this practice. And apparently, Americans are cannibals because he referenced Americans who have given him information. He references his research often, and he says at the end of his proposal, I have nothing to gain from this proposal and only propose it out of the goodness of his heart, or my heart. So why wouldn't this argument work? I feel like maybe the only person that might have been persuaded by this is Hannibal Lecter, but I think for the rest of this, we're not going to be persuaded. So one of the reasons why a modest proposal didn't work is actually because Jonathan Swift didn't intend for it to work. He didn't truly want to eat children. What he wanted to do was to get his readers' attention so that he could persuade them with his real solutions to poverty, which he then presents at the end of the essay. For the moment, however, let's simply address the fact that this very thoughtful, well-argued essay was not persuasive. And again, this goes back to the relationship between logos, pathos, and ethos. No matter how well argued, if the audience is not open to the idea, or if the audience does not trust the writer, the audience will not be persuaded. Conversely, if the audience trusts the writer or speaker too much, then the audience can be persuaded with very little logic. So why do we bother with logos? The main reason why we bother with logos is because it makes it harder for the opposition to tear down. We can fault an argument for its use of pathos or its use of ethos, but you cannot fault an argument for its use of logic. And if you are trying to, again, write a counter argument, when you see a hole in the logic, that's what you exploit. So now we're going to go ahead and put all of these ideas into practice. We're going to be looking at some commercials.